Hello and welcome back to the Get More Ministries YouTube channel, where we strive to help people grow closer to God by getting more out of the Bible. And this video is part of a series that's supposed to accompany a year-long Bible reading plan where we're reading the Bible cover to cover in the year of 2024. So what we are striving to do in these videos is just highlight how each book contributes to and helps propel the biblical narrative forward. There is an overarching narrative of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and we really become more familiar with that narrative as we simply read the text. So we distinguish between reading, studying, and meditating in the Bible. All three of those are slightly different approaches, and they yield slightly different results. So when we read, we are simply just being in the text. It's the constant absorption of the text. And the goal of reading is to cover ground in the text so that we become more familiar with the text and the overarching narrative. So these videos are designed to just kind of help us work through some of those connections and how everything fits together. This book that we're covering today is the book of Ruth. And so what I want to do is begin by kind of giving a little bit of a summary of where we've come thus far in the Old Testament so that we can dive in and kind of have our bearings in Ruth and understand that Ruth flows out of what has come before it and it sets up what comes after it. And so we want to be kind of aware of both of those simultaneously. So that's why we're going to start with a recap and then dive into Ruth. Let me share my screen and pull up some notes, and we will get underway. All right, so we're going to start with after the Exodus for our recap. So God calls his people out of Egypt. He delivers them, and then they end up rebelling against him in the wilderness, and then that generation, that Exodus generation, dies in a 40-year wandering through the wilderness. Then the next generation, that second generation, they are the ones that actually enter into the promised land. So that second generation receives the law in Deuteronomy. Then they actually enter into the promised land in Joshua. And then in Judges, we see kind of where that second generation ends and where the next generation and generations begin. And we see those third and fourth and subsequent generations in the promised land, and it's a very cyclical pattern of unfaithfulness to Yahweh, and then they end up getting conquered by their enemies, and then they cry out to God, and then he saves them. And so it's very much chaos in Judges. So how does that help us better understand the book of Ruth? Well, what we need to be aware of that we can see here in Ruth 1:1 is that the book of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. Okay, so this little 4-chapter book, it's really short. I'd encourage you to read it in one sitting. Takes place in the time period of the Judges. So Israel's in the promised land, and they don't have a centralized leader like they did with Moses or Joshua. They're actually kind of the government is administered kind of through these judges periodically, and the judges serve both kind of as a centralized administrator, but also an influence on the religious system, and that is where we're at. So Ruth takes place within the overarching timeline of the book of Judges. And what we see here in Ruth 1:1 is that there's a famine in the land. And again, we have to remember what came before Ruth, namely that when God was explaining to Israel his expectations for them entering the promised land and what will happen should they be faithful to the covenant or should they be unfaithful to the covenant. If they're faithful to the covenant, then the land will have rich produce and he will bless it and they'll have abundance. But if they're unfaithful, then the land will not have produce, and everything will start to go in a downward direction. So we can see here, Ruth 1:1, during the time of the Judges, there was a famine in the land. Okay, so automatically we should kind of be dialed in on probably a period of unfaithfulness, or at the very least, we're in a prolonged season of cyclical unfaithfulness in the time of the judges. But really, as the story of Ruth unfolds, we see kind of two characters come to the forefront, and these two characters exhibit covenant faithfulness throughout the story, even though the nation at large is cyclically unfaithful. And so Ruth has this kind of this tension in it, right? So on the one hand, we know that there's unfaithfulness kind of overall. Then on the other hand, we see these two characters, namely Ruth and Boaz, that are exhibiting covenant faithfulness within these, circumstances of the rest of the nation. And so we see God at work through that, and ultimately the story has a really beautiful ending that, again, exhibits God's complete faithfulness within those circumstances of the judges, but then also sets us up for what we're going to read next in Samuel. So what I want to do is just touch a little bit on how both Ruth and Boaz exhibited covenant faithfulness, and a little bit of how, we see what Israel's instructed to do in the law, and then we see Ruth and Boaz actually doing that. So first thing we need to know is that Ruth is a Moabitess, because we see here in Ruth 1:1 through 5, Naomi and her family, they actually leave the land of Israel. They go to Moab because there's a famine. And in the land of Moab, Naomi's sons marry Moabite women. And one of those women that becomes her daughter-in-law was Ruth. And so then eventually Naomi decides to return to the land of Israel, and Ruth decides to come with her. But the other daughter-in-law, Orpah, she decides to remain in Moab. So the first thing we see is Ruth, a foreigner to the land of Israel, clings not only to her mother-in-law, but by doing that, by making that decision, she's also deciding to cling to Yahweh and have him be her God. So that's the first thing. She's committing to the God of Israel. Which, again, if we remember back into the law, the first commandment of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5 is, you shall have no other gods before me. Right? So we see Ruth kind of embracing that mentality and lifestyle and disposition, orientation towards God. The second thing that we see from Ruth, the second exhibition of her covenant faithfulness, is she assumes responsibility for providing for her widowed mother-in-law. So both Ruth and Naomi are widows. Ruth is obviously younger than Naomi, and Ruth assumes the responsibility of providing for her widowed mother-in-law. So when they get back to Israel, let me see, I actually didn't write this verse down, so let me find it. Tom is excited. Don't call me Ruth. Yep. So Ruth asks Naomi in Ruth 2:2, will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor? So she's assuming the responsibility of acquiring provision for her mother-in-law. This goes back to Deuteronomy 24:19 through 21. So let me pull that up really quick. 24:19. So God has provided instruction for Israel regarding harvesting their fields. And he says, when you reap the harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, do not go back and get it. It is to be left for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you knock down the fruit of your olive tree, do not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. What remains is to be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. So what we see here with Ruth is, oops, I forgot to put that's why. Ruth 2. Ruth is operating and knowing that, okay, I'm the one between Naomi and myself who's able to provide for my widowed mother-in-law. And I also know that in the land of Israel, people like me, resident aliens, and widows are provided provision from the Lord in the law that says we can go in behind the harvesters and glean what is left over. So that's the second way that she exhibits covenant faithfulness, is that she assumes responsibility for her mother-in-law, and she also begins operating within the law, the religious law of the land, the Mosaic law. And now I want to actually jump up to Boaz, because I'm going to kind of go in chronological order of Ruth here. So Boaz comes to find out about Ruth because she's gleaning in his field. And then Boaz decides to uphold this command in Deuteronomy 24 as well. So he sees Ruth, and he knows her connection with Naomi, and he knows Naomi, and he said, yes, I'm actually also going to allow this to happen. But not only am I going to allow it to happen, I'm actually going to tell Ruth that she should only work in my fields. Like, don't go to another field. He says here in Ruth 2:8, then Boaz said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting in and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled. So he tells Ruth to just exclusively work in his field, and he ensures protection for her as she does so. So he's exhibiting the heart of the law. He's supposed to not only provide and allow people like Ruth to gather provisions, but he is specifically protecting her in that endeavor. So those are the first two ways that Boaz exhibits covenant faithfulness. He upholds Deuteronomy 24:19 through 21, and then he ensures Ruth is protected as she pursues that. But then also, as we keep going, Boaz actually wants Yahweh to bless Ruth to the fullest extent that he has promised to bless his people, should they be faithful. So he says here in verse 11 of chapter 2, everything you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. Remember, that's pretty significant on Ruth's part, because she's a foreigner, and she left her entire world behind, and she came to a foreign land to embrace a foreign god from her native culture. Picking up in verse 12, may the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. So Boaz is acknowledging Ruth's massive step of faith in embracing, in her clinging to Naomi. She's embracing Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he recognizes that, and he wants Yahweh to bless her to the fullest extent that Yahweh has claimed that he would. So that's just another way that we see Boaz is he has the heart of someone that really the law is designed to instill within people. He has faith in Yahweh, and he's striving to uphold the law and the heart behind the law, not just the letter of it, to the extent that he remains. He's not just upholding the law insofar as he can while also maintaining his own self-interest. He's upholding it to the fullest extent that he's intended to. Moving on, the fourth thing that Boaz does is he sacrifices some of his harvest to ensure that Ruth and Naomi are taken care of. So not only does he allow Ruth to glean what's left over in his field, not only does he ensure Ruth's protection in her endeavor to do so, but he actually tells his servants, his workers in the fields, in chapter 2, 15 through 16, that they are to make it easier for her. They're actually supposed to remove some of what they've harvested for Boaz and leave it for Ruth. So he says here, Let her even gather grain among the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Pull out some stalks from the bundles for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her. So he's like, not only are we going to ensure that she can pick up what we've missed, we're actually going to take some of what we didn't miss, what's intended for my storehouses, and we're going to leave it for her. Again, Boaz is embracing the heart behind the law. And we see, a figure who's exhibiting covenant faithfulness within a historical setting of the nation's overarching unfaithfulness. And then finally, the fifth thing for Boaz is he is willing to bear the responsibility of a family redeemer to Ruth and Naomi. So as we move on into chapters 3 and 4, we learn that Boaz is a close relative of Naomi, and he can function as a family redeemer for the sake of Naomi. And he's willing to do that. And so we see that in chapter 3, verses 12 through 13, where he tells Ruth, yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that is good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. And when you see figures in the Old Testament say, as the Lord lives, they are promising to do something it's like the absolute most sincere promise that a human can make. Because as the Lord lives, they're saying, as surely as the Lord lives, which he obviously does and has always existed, then I will do this. So they're saying the only way that I won't do this is if the Lord doesn't live, which he does live. So he's making a very sincere promise to Ruth, and we see him following through on that. The next day he goes to the city gates, and he meets with that gentleman who is a closer redeemer than himself. He presents, hey, you can redeem Naomi's family inheritance. Oh, but then, by the way, when you do so, you're going to have to marry the Moabitess Ruth. The closer redeemer says, no, I actually can't do that because I'm going to jeopardize my own inheritance. So then Boaz follows through. And I want to just touch base a little bit on that because, again, it illustrates the heart of Boaz, and he is someone, he represents what everyone in Israel should be like. So I'm going to make sure that this works. First of all, I'm going to go over to, so now I'm going over to my other Bible software because one is just not enough, obviously. So when the other family redeemer replies that Boaz is having this interaction with at the gate, he says, I can't redeem it myself, meaning Naomi's inheritance, the property. I can't redeem this property myself, or I will ruin my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption because I can't redeem it. So once the stipulation of marrying Ruth comes into play, that other guy backs out of it. And I'm going to turn over here to the Faith Life Study Bible over here in Logos Bible software. And it says, redeeming Ruth and producing an heir for the line of Elimelech, which is Naomi's deceased husband, would damage his own children's inheritance. Redeeming the land by itself would have been a good investment for this other redeemer, because the land would be inherited by the redeemer's own children. But redeeming Ruth with the land would result in it being left to Ruth's offspring, or for the line of Elimelech. Any resources spent on redeeming the land and raising the offspring would damage his own children's inheritance, since it would benefit the line of Elimelech. And I'm just going to double check. I said that Elimelech was Ruth's deceased husband. I'm just going to, or name was deceased husband. Yeah. So yeah, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. I just wanted to make sure that I was remembering that correctly. So this other redeemer backs out of it because he's like, whoa, if I marry Ruth, now I jeopardize my biological descendants who are going to inherit my property. And so he backs out of it. But Boaz embraces that responsibility. And he moves forward with redeeming not only Naomi's property, but Ruth as well. So Boaz is willing to uphold his responsibility as a family redeemer, even though it's going to potentially jeopardize his own estate. And then finally, towards the end of chapter 4, Ruth and Boaz, they become married. They have a child. And again, this child doesn't belong to Boaz's line. It belongs to Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech's line. And we see here in 4:16 where, here we go. Naomi took the child, the child born to Ruth and Boaz. Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. So the final way that Ruth exhibits covenant faithfulness, and this is also Boaz, but I put it under Ruth's category. The final way that she exhibits covenant faithfulness is that she faithfully operates within the parameters of that God laid out for family redeemers. So she bears a son, but she recognizes this son goes towards her deceased father-in-law's inheritance. And so this son is actually going to take care of Naomi in Naomi's old age, and he's going to operate as the heir to Elimelech's estate, who was Naomi's deceased husband. So Ruth and Boaz are fully submitted to this process of family redeemer. And it's really beautiful because we see covenant faithfulness being exhibited within a time period of largely, covenant unfaithfulness during the time of the judges. Now, the last thing that makes it really significant, this story of Ruth, that we learn at the end here, is the end of chapter 4, which is the end of the book. And starting in verse 17, I'm going to read it through the end. The neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the family records of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And that's how the book of Ruth concludes. Now, David comes to play here, you can see, in 1 Samuel, and that is our next book. So Ruth, it takes place in a period of cyclical unfaithfulness, but we have two main characters exhibiting covenantal faithfulness and operating as they should, and it harkens back to the heart behind the law, and then God moves in their circumstances, right? And lifts them up in their immediate circumstances. But then in doing so, he actually God doubles this and not only satisfies their immediate circumstances, but then also plays a long game and says that my faithfulness to Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi in their immediate circumstances is also going to double as long-term faithfulness and provision and redemption, not only for the nation of Israel through King David, but also for the entire world through King David because of David's ancestry leading up to the Christ. And so when we pop over to Matthew's genealogy, we see that Ruth and Boaz and Obed and Jesse and David are all in Jesus' genealogy, right? Aram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. And so this story of Ruth really is remarkable because not only does it exhibit faithfulness in the time of the judges, something that was rare, but then through God's overarching plan, we see his faithfulness to these three individuals, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, not only coming to full circle for them in their circumstances, but also extending into the nation at large through King David, and then extending further still through the world, or to the world, through Jesus, the eventual descendant of David. So it's a really cool story that links a lot of things together, and it speaks not only to the immediate circumstances, but also sets up the rest of the narrative moving forward. And so this book is fascinating. Read it in one sitting. It's just 4 chapters. 4 chapters is actually what we recommend for reading. You want to read in chunks so that you can get into a flow of the narrative, and you read at a pace that is typically easy to do every day. 4 chapters is about 15 minutes a day. But it's not so much that it's overwhelming, but it's enough to where you get into a rhythm and you're able to cover enough ground to where what you read yesterday and last week is still familiar to you as you read today's content. So pick up Ruth if you've never read it. Read it in one sitting. It's a great story. And then you can move straight into 1 Samuel after that, because those narratives are linked. And it's a really fascinating connection. So that's what I have for you for the book of Ruth, and I am excited to talk about 1 Samuel next, because that Genesis has probably historically been my favorite Old Testament book, but man, 1 Samuel for the last about 2 years has been giving it a run for its money. So I love 1 Samuel, and I'm looking forward to talking to that with you next. So I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy Bibling.